Welcome everybody. Today's interview with the Global Health Leaders Series. Today I'm interviewing the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Executive Secretary Elizabeth Mrema. I'm Dr. Keith Martin, the Executive Director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. We know that climate change is an existential threat to our own survival. However, there is another existential threat that receives far too little attention, and that is the massive loss of biodiversity that we're enduring today. Indeed, this loss of biodiversity, the sixth extinction crisis, is affecting all of us and has enormous implications. This loss of biodiversity, in fact, is at our hands, which means the solution to this immense challenge is also at our hands. Over 1 million species are actually threatened to extinction, but we're not only losing the number of species, we're also losing the number of members within those species, and there are enormous implications for this. So today, we're really honored to have Executive Secretary Mrema with us. Executive Secretary Mrema has been the head of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity since June of 2020. Prior to that, she was the director of the Law Division of the UN Environment Program in Nairobi. She's had 20 years experience in UN agencies. She has a Master of Laws degrees from Dalhousie University in Canada and also postgraduate degrees in international development. She's a Tanzanian national with extensive experience within the Tanzanian government. Executive Secretary Mrema, it is really an honor to have you here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure is mine.
Well, today I'd like to just start off because I think a lot of individuals may not actually know what the UN Convention on Biological Diversity is and what it does. Maybe you could just give us a thumbnail sketch about UNCBD.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Convention on Biological Diversity is a legally binding international treaty which was adopted way back in 1992. And if you recall 1992, this was the time of the first Rio Summit, which also adopted not just the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also that was when the Climate Change Convention was equally adopted and the Convention on Desertification. And the three, actually, we call them Rio Conventions, all adopted at the Rio Earth Summit 1992. Nonetheless, the Convention on Biological Diversity came into force operative in December 1993. Currently, it's almost a universal convention with 196 parties to it. We are only missing 2, and we hope the new administration of US will look at it. We are missing United States of America and the Vatican. Apart from that, all other countries globally are parties to it. That by itself demonstrates the importance of the Convention on Biological Diversity on global issues related to biodiversity and nature. It has 3 main goals. Much as we are almost 30 years since it was adopted, the goals are as important today as they were 30 years ago. And there are 1, conservation of biodiversity. 2, if we are able to conserve, 2, we have to ensure sustainable use of the components of biodiversity, or sustainable use of biodiversity. And 3, if we are able to conserve and sustainably use, we need to also ensure, and that's number 3, fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the genetic resources. The convention has 2 supplementary protocols, also with a number of parties to them. The first one is the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and the next one, another one, is the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. So actually the third objective has now led to a fully fledged protocol on its own, expanding exactly what is meant by fair and equitable sharing and how that can be done in practice at national level, particularly for those countries which are able to provide access to their genetic resources. So when it comes now to us at the Secretariat of the Convention, which was established for purposes of supporting the countries in the implementation of the convention. We therefore then have that objective of supporting and monitoring the implementation of the convention by the parties, supported by also all other partners, including the consortium, I believe, as the countries develop their national strategies for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and as they carry out actions to equitably then share the benefits arising from the use of the genetic resources. I can go on forever, but I think it's an introduction that may suffice.
No, that's perfect. That's a wonderful overview, and I think it's encouraging that you mentioned that there's almost universal adoption of the convention. Certainly, I hope that the new Biden administration will take this and sign on, and of course the Vatican too.
Looking
but I
forward.
think we will hope so. They're just around the corner from us here in Washington, D.C. So we will do our best.
So you'll be instrumental to help us.
We will definitely do our best, Elizabeth. They're just down the street at the White House. But I would like to just talk, I think a lot of people just, it's the disappearance of biodiversity. If you think about it, you'll actually recognize it in your own lives, but the actual massive scope in loss of not only species, but also the number of species and the size of those species is really happening in front of ourselves, but we're not recognizing that. Can you give us indication of actually the scope of the loss that the planet is enduring right now at our hands?
It's scary, if I may start, in terms of loss. Let me talk of the present state of biodiversity. Currently, all recent reports have confirmed biodiversity is declining at unprecedented rates in the history of humankind. Pressures driving this decline are even more intensifying. You had indicated at your introduction 1 million species, virtually out of 8.1 million species are now threatened with extinction, more than ever before in the history of humankind. The recent Living Planet Index, the 2020 Living Planet Index issued by the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, shows that 68% of monitored vertebrate species populations have declined between 1970 to 2016. The same report is also showing that 10% of insects are threatened. Over 40% of amphibian species are threatened. 33% of corals or reef-forming corals are disappearing. More than a third of all marine mammals are threatened. Virtually 90% of all domesticated breeds of mammals used for agriculture and food were already extinct by 2016, with at least about 1,000 more breeds still being threatened. So virtually our own human overuse of the Earth biocapacity by at least 56%, that equally also further contribute to that. And yet we know how important biodiversity is to the human well-being. If that's the amount of species we are losing at unprecedented rate, clearly then this continued loss of biodiversity and degradation presents fundamental risks to our health and the stability of the ecosystems which sustain all aspects of our societies today. Reduces the ability of the biodiversity and ecosystem to provide that life-sustaining services from food security, nutrition, regulation of water, regulation of air quality, including, of course, pests and disease control. Not only that, as the result of biodiversity loss, if it continues at this rate, clearly, then that threatens achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals, considering that 14 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we also expect contribution from biodiversity. Again, you also in your introduction mentioned the importance of climate action. And we know 30% of greenhouse gases come from nature or biodiversity, which actually provides solution to climate change mitigation and adaptation. 30%. So all these again indicates that the impact of that biodiversity loss to the lives of ourselves as human beings and our own human beings. And there are many factors which drive this biodiversity loss. You will recall the intergovernmental policy platform for science, biodiversity and ecosystems, IPBS, identified 5 primary drivers contributing to further threatening the biodiversity loss. Land use, sea use, so changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation and overexploitation of natural resources or organisms, climate change, a primary driver, pollution general, and pollution, this is air pollution, marine pollution, land pollution, pollution general, invasive alien species, another global challenge. So clearly, if there are these changes on the land and sea, that obviously will affect and impact the food being produced, without which then none of us will survive, which depends on biodiversity. So it is the food production, the food chain, the food supply, consumption and production, and the list can go on in terms of secondary or non-primary drivers of biodiversity loss. We know the impact of overfishing on the coastal development. Of course, climate change is even further adding to these adverse effects, not just on land, but also on the marine ecosystem. So all these factors clearly then drive biodiversity loss to the limits.
You used the initial word when I asked you this question was, I think, so apt to use the word frightening, because individuals like you who are at the cutting edge of trying to stop this existential crisis know how frightening it is. I think many people do not, and you well laid out the drivers of the loss of biodiversity and the web of life. You lose a species, you don't lose in isolation. It's part of a web of life that actually has downstream and domino effects that are quite significant. What is the arguments that we can learn from you and we can use to go to governments to describe to them what the value is and the importance is of investing, of mainstreaming conservation into their sustainable development efforts?
Very good question. Historically, the world has been looking at governments as if they are the sole responsible stakeholder when it comes to reversing and halting biodiversity loss. While in actual fact, it's not just the government. Unless each and every stakeholder, every sector take action in reversing and halting biodiversity loss, the government on its own cannot make a difference, because the government will set out the policy, the principles, the regulations, but actions on the ground have to be undertaken by other stakeholders. 1, 2, over time, we've also realized that to be able to get other stakeholders on board, we need to speak their language. So equally then, the government need to speak the language of the banker, the language of the business person who contributes to the pollution or to the land use and see changes in land use or sea use. So we also need to speak to the language of all different stakeholders for them to see the benefit of taking action. So why exactly, what should we talk in terms of why biodiversity should be protected? And why the language we use is equally important. If we talk to an economist, even if the government talks to an economist, to a banker, to a business person or business sector, they need to know how much of their revenue they will lose for not taking care of biodiversity or nature or ecosystem. And statistics, recent reports have clearly shown, for instance, half of the global GDP moderately or highly is dependent on nature and its services, specifically $44 trillion dependent on nature. So such a statistics to a banker, to a financial, to a private sector draws attention. Not only that, we know 70% of people living in poverty actually their life depends, or their livelihood depends on the natural resources coming from land. It is agriculture for their livelihood. It is fisheries for their livelihood. 2.6 billion draw their livelihood from agriculture. 1.6 from the forest. 250 million from fisheries. So this language, particularly with statistics, will enable us to draw that attention.
And I think you mentioned another really important point. You wove in the importance of protecting biodiversity with achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think your point is superb, in that we will not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals unless we're able to arrest the loss of biodiversity that's occurring. Yep. The other point I just want to pick up at the end is how we can, from your perspective, how can we mainstream conservation as a tool to reduce poverty? Because we mentioned, as you mentioned, a lot of individuals, particularly around biodiversity hotspots, are Indigenous people, are people who live in rural environments. How can we do a better job of integrating conservation into sustainable development practices that act to reduce poverty and improve people's access to the social determinants of health?
You have raised an important point of mainstreaming biodiversity and conservation, because without which, and these are some of the lessons we learned from the failures of the H biodiversity target. Biodiversity issues are not issues to be handled by the ministries of environment on their own. It needs all other sectors. You cannot talk of biodiversity without agricultural ministries, fisheries ministries, national planning, economic ministries, all stakeholders. So basically, at national level, global level, we need to redouble efforts to bring biodiversity into the mainstream of decision making, to be able to recognize the pressures that threaten nature, and the contribution to the people can only be eased if biodiversity is factored across the policies in a whole of government, whole of society approach across all economic sectors. So we literally need an integrated, as I said, whole of government, whole of society approach to be able then to improve how we manage natural environment, because biodiversity cuts across all sectors of the economy. And unless we sit together and talk and agree in a coordinated, collaborative, cooperative manner, will not reach far. Currently, as the result of the pandemic, we keep underlining the importance of One Health approach, which basically is that calling for whole of society, whole of government approach in improving biodiversity management and conservation. We need, in this process, the businesses to also mainstream biodiversity into their activities and production, to be able then to promote sustainability in their supply chains, and to design also their product portfolio based on human and planetary health. That's why all stakeholders need to be involved, that across the society, whole of society.
And conservation, as you mentioned, it's not a luxury, it's actually an essential element of our own survival, if you will. And you were referring to the pandemic, that the horrible pandemic that the world is enduring right now. I wanted to bore down a little bit more into that, because we know that the beginning of that pandemic and previous pandemics and spillover events are often when a virus jumps the species barrier from a non-human animal to a human animal. And this took place, from all indications, in Wuhan, China. It started there, but we've seen it happen in other parts of the world, in the West African Ebola crisis and HIV, in other outbreaks around the world. But the pandemic is an opportunity to build forward better, to actually use conservation as a tool for pandemic prevention. Can you share with us some thoughts about how we can use this moment in time to build forward better, to use the pandemic to actually reduce the risk factors of spillover events, whether it's through wildlife trafficking, which is a threat to biodiversity, or wet markets, or the destruction of ecosystems that put us into contact with potentially lethal pathogens?
Important question, especially this particular time the entire world is. And while we are in solidarity with the global community, with the challenges being faced, and with the governments really helping to rebuild, particularly the health sector, to be able to cope with the situation. The bottom line, moving to the future, and there's an opportunity, and as our UN Secretary General has equally underlined, we need to build back better. What does it mean? We need to build back green, not brown, green, so that then the pandemic reinforces the need for global cooperation, global collaboration, as recovery policies are being developed, to be able to focus on the well-being and inclusiveness, to be able also to trigger green investments. But also, human beings, we need to change our behavior. Behavioral change will be key to reduce future shocks and to be able to build the resilience on the society. When we talk, of course, of also building back better, that includes alignment with long-term emission goals, factoring in resilience to climate change, to be able also to slow down biodiversity loss. We need to invest in prevention, investments in pandemic prevention, which costs far less than the actual response the entire world is in currently. And of course, we know how long-term consequences the pandemics have on people's health, on productivity, diversion of resources from non-emergency healthcare to other public goods and services. And we've seen it, what has happened in the last several months. We know, for instance, in 2003, when SARS outbreak happened, just in that 1 year, it is estimated $52 billion had been spent. While we know the COVID in 2020 alone, the global economy, it had costed already the $1 trillion plus of the global economy. I don't think prevention would have costed this much in terms of long term. So really need to reinvest into greener biodiversity, greener recovery, and realign subsidies from unsustainable measures to sustainability, green investment, green biodiversity. Move away from fossil fuels to greener and more incentivized biodiversity. So basically, the $500 million billion spent per year on unsustainable subsidies, if those funds were to be used for sustainable agricultural production, for instance, fisheries production, probably the multitude of resources we need to take action, for the world to take action on biodiversity loss, will be far less by just realigning the existing resources.
And that's a critically important point, is that a concrete policy initiative that governments can do is to end subsidies to the fossil fuel sector, use those subsidies, which as you mentioned are substantial, and use those to incentivize the private sector to convert to a greener, more sustainable practices, whether it's agriculture or others. It would also give conservation, which is starved for money chronically, the funds to be able to invest and protect ecosystems that are critically important. I mean, on the health side, I want to add one more part, if I may, and that is people don't recognize the importance of green space to addressing non-communicable diseases that are responsible for 70% of deaths worldwide. So not only, as you mentioned, investing in conservation is a preventative tool for spillovers and pandemics, but it also has significant implications for addressing the non-communicable diseases. I wanted to draw the listeners, the viewers' attention to a really important document that the convention put out called the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, which is such an excellent document that provided specific actions that can be done. Can you share with us a little bit more information about the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 and some of those actions that we can all take?
Yes, and thank you. Yes, Global Biodiversity Outlook, which we launched last September, tried to take stock of where we are as the decade was coming to an end, as the Aichi biodiversity targets were coming to an end. Unfortunately, the conclusions drawn from the report were not so positive as far as global biodiversity is concerned. And as I had indicated earlier, the report further confirmed the unprecedented rate of biodiversity loss in the history of mankind, and that we are at crossroads where we really need to look at the relationship between nature and human action, because biodiversity loss is caused by human actions, by my actions and your actions, and unless and only we humans can reverse and halt that biodiversity loss. But of course, also the report acknowledged the progress made, particularly as far as national actions taken at national level. Unfortunately, progress at national level, although far advanced, were not aligned with the global agreed targets. So when you look at you put in terms of a scale at global level, we say we have failed, but a lot of progress had been made at national level. Some of those lessons. The report then, of course, made particularly 8 major recommendations or 8 transitions, which will be needed to slow and then be able to halt nature's accelerating decline and enable to move the society into a more sustainable coexistence with nature. Probably I will only take 4 key ones, since I'll need more time to go through the 8. You remember one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss primary driver is land and sea use. So one of the main recommendations is transition on land and forest. We need to conserve intact ecosystem, restore ecosystems, combat and reverse degradation, and be able to employ landscape level spatial planning to avoid, reduce, and mitigate land use change. 2, we need to transition to sustainable food systems. And to do that, it means we must enable sustainable and healthy diets with greater emphasis on diversity of foods, more moderate consumption of red meat and fish, to get them multiply and be able to make drastic cuts in the waste involved with the supply of food and consumption. We know 30% of food produced does not reach the population kitchen. It all goes in waste, while other parts of the world are starving. So that need to change. And again, it is us human beings. Third, sustainable fisheries and ocean transition. We need to protect and restore marine and ecosystems. We need to rebuild fisheries. We need to manage aquaculture and other users of the oceans to really ensure that sustainability, to be able to enhance food security. And once we do that, it means the livelihood will further be secured. Bringing this plus all other recommendations bring us to one key transition which builds all that together: One Health. And that One Health is the need to be able to promote healthy ecosystem, healthy people, take integrated approach to managing ecosystems, use of wildlife, use of wildlife, human health, closely connected to health of animals and our shared environment. So the One Health approach brings that sustainable and sustainable fisheries, sustainable consumption, all that together in a coherent whole society, whole of government approach I talked to before. And all these actions then will be mutually supportive and contribute to 2030 agenda. So basically, we will reach these milestones without adding, so to speak, additional obligations on different stakeholders.
And you just showed how everything is just interconnected in what we do. Before we're approaching the end of the interview, Elizabeth, I wanted to talk about one final issue before leaving some time for any closing remarks that you may have. It's on wildlife trafficking. And most people, I think, know about the issue of wildlife trafficking. It is actually a health risk. You're a lawyer by trade. You were working in international law and particularly in conservation. Can you share with us what actions can be done to reduce demand for wildlife trafficking, which is one of the drivers of biodiversity loss? And it's not only animals, as we know, it's for timber, it's for a lot of species.
Going straight to your question, wildlife trade is important. As you said, the world needs timber. The world needs the animals. The animals, the wildlife animals provide also food security for a number of communities. The timber, the forest, that's where the building construction comes in. The medicines also comes from the wild. So we cannot avoid that wildlife trade. What is needed is regulated, legalized, monitored kind of trade. And therefore, we need stricter controls on the sale and consumption of wild species. We need stricter application of international health regulations, which really need to be scaled up at global level. And we know this pandemic has clearly taught us that many of the recent emerging infectious diseases originate from wildlife species. 60% of infectious diseases are zoonotic, transmitting from animals to humans. 75% infectious, again, from animals to humans. So literally, illegal wildlife trade makes the situation even worse. It enriches few and makes the whole world suffer. And this is where we are. The economies have suffered, tourism has suffered. Everything has suffered. So really stricter controls are needed. Blanket ban on trade or farming and consumption of wild species or clamping down of wildlife markets, that will not eliminate the risk of future zoonotic spillover. because we need measures which also do not undermine the livelihood and the nutrition food security of the million of local communities which are dependent on the wildlife species for their food, for their livelihood, because that's the low income rural areas depend on. So total ban is not a solution, and total ban will actually create the market for illegal trade. So that will not be a solution.
And I think you described the wild
Yes.
trade, the illegal trade in wildlife is a hardly victimless crime, whether it's the murder of park rangers or the loss of income for communities that live near important biodiversity hotspots, or the impact on tourism that occurs, and the people who really pay the price of those individuals who live near those areas. And some of them are some of the most impoverished people in the world, and sometimes their lives are put at risk by virtue of those who are going in there to destroy the wildlife that belongs to them. Executive Secretary Mrema, before I close, I just want to give you a few moments if there are any closing comments that you'd like to make. This has been a wonderful interview.
We have talked a lot, or I've shared quite a lot in response to your questions. But I think, to me, one key message is the world, all of us human beings, to understand that nature is us, and the earth we depend on nature, but unless we conserve that nature, nature cannot pay back to us. We have seen how nature is paying back to us currently in the lockdown situation, pandemic we are. So clearly that should be a reminder, a stark reminder to all of us that we need to change our relationship with nature. Every action we take, and we should not look at government, we need to begin at our personal level in our own homes. How do I deal with my own waste? How do I look at the choice of my anything I buy? Is it the choice of my clothing? Is it the choice of the food I take? Do I always want these red glittering tomatoes because they've been washed, while the other tomatoes all wasted because they are not in good shape, they are not in standard shape, goes to a waste, while the rest of the population, bigger part of the population out there is craving for it, is starving. So my main message, all action begins with individual. If we are able to take action at individual level, it means we will understand what it means at global level. And at global level is what we see happening around us. So then we will be able to contribute through those global actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Those are powerful words to close on. You've given us all a lot to think about. You've not only shown us the immense challenge before us, the frightening, to use your comment, frightening threat the loss of biodiversity is to all of us and indeed the planet, and you provided us a hopeful path forward on what all of us can do to address the loss of biodiversity before us, which is an existential threat. As you mentioned, we cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals without achieving and addressing the loss of biodiversity before us. And in fact, I would encourage all of us to think of biodiversity as our life support system. And if we damage the planet's biodiversity, we're damaging our own life support system, and there's no coming back. And in fact, as some have said, that we are currently the last generations that can actually stop the loss of biodiversity on our planet. It's up to us. It's in our hands. We can do it. Executive Secretary Mrema, thank you so much for your time. We wish you the very best of luck, and here at CUGH and our global health community, we stand with you in the challenge in addressing this enormous, important existential challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. Nature is in our hands. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.